You start a conversation with a simple, logical question. The other person responds, but instead of an answer, they fire back with immediate hostility. In seconds, a mundane exchange snaps into a bitter, irrational argument. Standard communication theories often fail to explain these sudden escalations. They treat them as subjective mysteries, tangled in invisible emotional baggage. Psychiatrist Eric Berne approached the problem differently. He developed Transactional Analysis, a framework that treats human behavior like an observable engineering diagram. Berne defined the transaction as the absolute basic unit of social interaction. It consists entirely of one stimulus and one response. His thesis proposed that by decomposing human personality into distinct structural states, we can mathematically map and predict interpersonal dysfunction. Communication failure is rarely a random accident. It is a mechanical error that can be objectively diagrammed, traced, and corrected. To understand why a transaction fails between two people, we have to structurally dissect the communicators themselves. Historical Freudian psychoanalysis relied on abstract subconscious drives. Berne shifted the focus entirely to tangible, observable behaviors. Look at these early notes mapping out the theory. Berne took Freud's complex framework of the id, ego, and superego and translated it into three highly accessible, observable states: child, adult, and parent. These ego states operate concurrently within every adult, functioning as active, coexisting systems rather than developmental phases we leave behind in childhood. Together, they form the PAC structural model. Every word spoken and every reaction felt originates from exactly one of these three distinct operational states, which allows for the objective categorization of any human interaction. Clinical structural analysis is the process of identifying exactly which ego state is driving the interaction. The parent state is a literal playback of early caregivers. It manifests as strict rule following in the critical parent or protective guidance in the nurturing parent. The child state is the raw replay of early emotions and defensive adaptations. It drives spontaneous, rebellious action in the free child or compliant behavior in the adapted child. Centered between them is the adult state. This is the rational processing core that operates strictly in the here and now. The adult acts as an objective computer. It evaluates facts and mediates between rigid rules of the parent and raw feelings of the child. Recognizing which of these three internal states is active is the required first step before you can analyze any interaction between two different people. When two people interact, we can map communication vectors to track the exact trajectory of a message from one person's PAC stack to the other's. Healthy communication requires a complementary transaction where the response comes from the exact ego state that was addressed. This chart maps these vectors out. Looking at the top diagram, as long as the stimulus and response lines remain parallel, communication can theoretically continue indefinitely without conflict. These stable transactions don't have to be adult to adult. They can be unequal. A critical boss acting as a parent can demand a report from a compliant employee acting as a child, and the vectors remain parallel. The core anomaly in this system is the crossed transaction. This is the exact mathematical point where communication completely breaks down. Look at the middle diagram here. A person in the child state asks to have fun, addressing the other's parent, but they receive an unexpected critical response directed at their child state. Because the response comes from an unaddressed ego state, the visual vectors cross, instantly halting the original subject of communication. Interpersonal conflicts are rarely about the topic discussed. They are structural collisions caused by crossed communication vectors. While crossed transactions cause obvious arguments, the most dangerous communication failures are entirely invisible on the surface, hidden from plain sight. This diagram reveals the mechanics of an ulterior transaction. On the bottom, notice the dual paths. A socially acceptable, overt message travels from adult to adult, but it disguises a covert psychological payload aimed directly at the child. Think of everyday sarcasm, subtle but cruel teasing, and manipulative sales tactics. They all operate entirely on this dual vector system. These covert moves string together into predictable patterns. Berne called studying these patterns game analysis. Humans play these psychological games outside of conscious awareness. We do it to satisfy a foundational biological need for strokes, or basic units of recognition. Strokes can be positive, like praise, or negative, like criticism. Disturbingly, the human brain will subconsciously seek out negative strokes if the alternative is receiving no strokes at all. These ulterior games force participants into an inescapable framework called the drama triangle. A game requires 3 mandatory roles: a powerless victim, a superiority-seeking rescuer, and a controlling persecutor. Individuals predictably rotate through these roles during an interaction to extract their required psychological payoff. Repetitive interpersonal drama is not an accident of circumstance. It is a highly structured, subconscious strategy used to systematically extract psychological resources from others. If we scale this model inward, we can examine structural integrity. What happens when an individual's PAC model physically degrades? Severe psychological disturbances are structural failures of the internal ego boundaries. In a state of contamination, the borders bleed across one another. When the parent contaminates the adult, unverified biases and learned rules are falsely processed as rational facts. This mechanism creates severe prejudice. The reverse is equally damaging. When raw emotion of the child contaminates the adult, internal fantasies are processed as external reality, resulting in delusion. Total systemic failure is known as exclusion, occurring when ego nodes are completely severed and blocked from the system. The clinical outcomes of exclusion are severe. A system without the child node becomes a rigid, joyless neurosis. Conversely, because the parent node houses our learned social rules and conscience, its total exclusion removes the internal moral restraint associated with psychopathy. Mental health is heavily dependent on internal geometry. It requires maintaining distinct, uncontaminated borders between past programming, present logic, and childhood emotions. The ultimate goal of transactional analysis therapy is to repair these internal structures and to achieve true autonomy. Autonomy does not mean permanently staying in a cold, logical adult state at all times. This network diagram illustrates what a healthy psychological structure looks like. It allows for spontaneous, fluid access to all 3 states, depending on what the present environment requires. An integrated adult can consciously deploy a nurturing parent to comfort a grieving friend, or access a free child to enjoy a creative task, all without losing overall control of the system. This structural flexibility requires a moment of active, real-time observation. By pausing to recognize an incoming communication vector, we can use the technique of mindfulness to consciously choose the response node that fits the situation, rather than reacting blindly. By mastering the architecture of our interactions, we cease to be passive victims of our childhood scripts. We become active engineers of our own reality,